When we start a Signs of the Times talk with referring to the unbelievable package that our God has given us over the last 5 or 6 years, fraction more, in fact. And I normally would use 4 or 5 slides to do that. So I've distilled it down in one slide, just to give you a feel for what we haven't seen from the time that I was baptised right down to 2015. I was baptised in the year of the Six-Day War, 1967. Sort of gives a bit of a clue to my age. But this package that God has given us in these last, 15 to 23, 8 years, I don't think we haven't seen. So I think even in that, there is a very clear sign from our God that things are being brought to a head. You know, we've seen things along the way, but nothing like this. 2015, we saw the Arab Spring, which began in 2011, culminate in Russia entering into Syria in October of that year. And Netanyahu said at the time, Israel now has a Russian border, which is effectively what happened and what exists today. In 2016, on the 23rd of June, Britain voted to leave the European Union, and after some terrible, painful years, finally in January 2020, that link with Europe was broken. That's required by Bible prophecy. Britain will not be part of anything to do with the Russian Confederacy. They are, in fact, the opposition to it when they come down upon the mountains of Israel. 2017, on the very last day of that year, 31st of December at 11:45 p.m, so they only had 15 minutes until the new year, the Likud Party, in the absence of their leader at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, made a decision to ultimately annex all of the West Bank. And events since that time have shown that they intend to do that. In that same year, 2017, Donald Trump, in his first year of office, began to work to bring about Middle East peace. And of course, that culminated in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. Quite remarkable, the things that have happened. That is required by Ezekiel 38:13, because Sheba and Dedan, Sheba is Yemen, Dedan incorporates the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, have to actually be allies of Israel at the time of Armageddon. 2020 through 23, COVID, the global pandemic, turned the world upside down, and we'll be talking about some of the consequences of that for the world's economy in a moment. 2019 began a period of time when China refused to accept goods from, for example, Australia. China is Australia's largest trading partner. And so this forced Australia to do something that they didn't want to do. They have now had to build trading relationships with other nations, and at the top of the list of those nations is Britain and India. All right, so we're talking about young lion powers. So China's economy at the present, as you'll see in a moment, is the trigger for the coming depression, and I'll talk a lot more about that. Now, normally, I talk about the coming depression at the end of the Signs of the Times talks, by which time most people are asleep. So, sorry about that, but you get the idea. By that time, you're exhausted, because I normally put too much into this. So I've taken the talk I gave a couple of weeks ago up in Canada, and I've trimmed it, and I've turned it upside down. And I'm going to talk about the coming depression first, straight up, and then we'll deal with some other things. 2022 saw Russia invade the Ukraine on the 24th of February. And of course, it also saw the death of Queen Elizabeth. Now, I'm not going to talk about her and her reign of 70 years tonight, but in actual fact, if you've heard about this, you'll know that that's a fulfillment of Bible prophecy in Isaiah 23. So some very important things have happened. So what about this year in which we find ourselves? Well, 2023 has seen a firming up of global hardship. It has been a year marked by increasing hardship all around the world, And they call it a cost of living crisis. And I think you've probably got the same crisis in this country that we have in Australia. We are now seeing a lot of people who no longer have a home to live in. They're living out of their cars or under bus shelters. We have never seen that in Australia. I mean, Los Angeles has had it for years, but we don't see it in Australia, but we are seeing it now. Food and housing shortages are common around the world. So why is that fact important to us, do you think? Well, it's important because of what we've just read in Luke chapter 17, verses 26 to 30 is the area I want to focus on. But Luke 21, 34 and 35 essentially says the same thing. So we're going to spend some time dealing with that. In addition, we hope to cover tonight why the world has plunged into utter insanity on a wide range, a plethora of social issues, why it's mature. We want to have a look at the future of the war in Ukraine, and we want to have a look at the continuous multiple disasters which the world attributes to climate change, which has destabilised economies and has brought fearfulness to many people in our world. They wonder what's around the corner. How can this be resolved? Where is this heading? So let's start with Luke chapter 17 and the Lord's warning about what it would be like when he returned. Now, I was criticised a couple of years ago because I gave an exhortation in 2021 when the global pandemic had locked a lot of things down. Our country was locked down. You couldn't have a wedding, right? You couldn't go, freely shopping all over the place. You couldn't cross the border into another state. We were locked down. You weren't able to do the things that Christ said men would be doing when he came. And I pointed out, brothers and sisters, this is a time for us to prepare because he's not going to come right now. He told us he's not going to come right now, but he will come when this prosperity is unleashed again, when men go back to doing what they were doing before the pandemic closed the world down. And we're there. We're there now. But the prosperity is fast disappearing. So if you've picked up on what I'm trying to say, we are, I believe, on the cusp of the return of Christ. And I'll give you the reasons why I believe that. Now, when you look at Luke 17, the Lord chooses these two eras. He could have chosen any era of divine judgment, but he chooses these two. Why would he do that? Well, they are both eras of divine judgment, of course, but most importantly, they were both periods of prosperity. And they both provide the pattern for Christ's return to the earth like no other. So we need to focus on it. So we've got the time of Noah when there was general prosperity for 120 years. And we know the story. The time came, God locked Noah and his family away in the ark, and then the prosperity of mankind disappeared. Within a week, it was gone. The time of Lot, there was local, regional prosperity, and it all ended in a day. Now, that's the pattern. He's telling us that's the pattern. The time will come when we, like Noah and like Lot and his family, will be removed from this place to a much more secure place in the presence of Christ for the purpose of judgment. And there we're going to meet those who have been raised from the dead. They'll be there before us. And the world will collapse around us. And I'm going to demonstrate that that is what the scripture requires. So when you think about this, what were the things that sort of stood out in the times of Noah and Lot? Violence and immorality. Not one word, not a single word from our Lord about violence and immorality in what we've just read. Does that mean there would be none? Of course not. But he focuses on the one thing. The world's full of violence, isn't it? There's more guns in America than there are people. And one day they're going to use them. They're doing it in Texas already. Okay? Just a word of, just acknowledging Texas' position in the country. And what about immorality? All right? I mean, could it get more immoral? No. but he doesn't mention it. He knew it was going to happen, but he makes no mention of it. Why? Because you and I, brothers and sisters, are not likely to lose the kingdom because of getting involved in violence or immorality. But we might lose the kingdom if we're overwhelmed by prosperity and materialism. That's why he says, remember Lot's wife. She didn't want to leave. She was happy to stay. She could endure the immorality and the violence. She wanted to stay. Oh, she had family there that weren't going with them. Daughters that had married into the world. You can see that there was pressure on her. Remember Lot's wife. And that warning of verse 33 is very important. Luke 17:33. Whosoever shall seek to save his life. In other words, if you want to preserve what you've got now in this world, forget it. Forget the kingdom. That's what he's saying. But if you're prepared to give it up when the angel comes to your door and say, I can't wait to go, please take me, then you'll get eternal life. You'll preserve it. That's the challenge we've got. You get too integrated with this world, all the gadgets and all the technologies and all of the pleasures and all of the, the distractions, the entertainments. You get too involved in that, and you don't want to miss the next program of the soap opera that you've come to love. You think, I'm kidding. Yeah. If that's what you like, then you're Lot's wife. You won't want to go. You can't wait for the next match or whatever sport it might be. You've got to be here for the grand final. You get my point? That's the Lord's warning. Remember Lot's wife. She didn't want to go. Well, believe the truth. Went to the meetings, but didn't want to leave. So there's the challenge that the Lord presents. That's why he doesn't mention violence and immorality, because that's going to be the problem. Now, if you doubt that he's going to come in a time of prosperity, because I hear a lot of nonsense about this. I hear people misusing Matthew 24, that there's going to be a time of tribulation. You think along those lines, then you're not in accordance with Christ. He doesn't mention anything about us going through tribulation in this era. Oh, they did so prior to AD 70, but not in this era. That's not our problem. Our problem is complacency. And you see, the other proof of this is Revelation chapter 3. Now, I'm not going to put up a slide for the sake of time, but you can go, you know this passage. It's the letter to Laodicea. And you know also that those 7 letters are actually history from the time of John down to our day. Brother Mansfield, in his writings, suggests that this 7th letter to the Laodiceans is the period from the end of the Second World War to the return of Christ, the time of prosperity. I mean, it's been unbroken, hasn't it? Basically unbroken ever since then. And the world today, look, if you got your grandfather out of the grave and asked him, what was it like in the 1930s and 40s? And then you suddenly put them into this generation with all of the stuff that we've got and the gadgets we've got. It's another world. It is another world. You see, we're in this time when there are so many distractions. So here we've got prosperity. Now, in Revelation 3, when Christ writes to the Laodiceans, in that letter to them, for the last time, and the only time, he makes this statement. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. It's the one that deals with his return to the earth, if you're going to look at it prophetically. And their problem was not poverty or persecution, was it? He says, you are rich and increased in goods, with goods, and you have need of nothing. He's telling us he will come in a time of prosperity, but it is disappearing. You know that. It's disappearing. And so that tells us something. We've got to be close. He comes to raise the dead. And if you have a look at Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, and read it carefully, this is what it says. Twice this opening statement is made. And at that time shall Michael stand up, that great prince which stands for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation upon earth. And at that time, many that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting shame and contempt. What it tells you is that the resurrection and the beginning of the time of trouble, such as never was, are concomitant events. They happen at the same time. Resurrection, the world's economy collapses. Mankind goes into a period of time that history has never seen. Think about that. History has never seen it. Forget about the First World War, Second World War. Forget about all that. History has never seen a time like this, because the light will have been taken out of the world, and Isaiah 60 will come to pass. Gross darkness shall cover the earth. Gross darkness when there's no light. It's gone. You can cut the darkness with a knife. That's when criminality, violence of all kinds will break forth in a way that mankind has never seen, and America will lead the world in it. You haven't got it, you take it. That's why many Americans are prepping. You know that, don't you? They've got TV shows about Americans prepping. They're digging holes in the ground. They're buying up old mine shafts. They're buying up old military buildings, and they're building them into fortresses. They're stocking them with all sorts of food that will last for years. They've got water supplies, deep wells. They're prepping because they know it's coming. And they're right. It is coming. So let's talk about where we're up to in relation to the world's economy. I asked the question, how many more straws are needed to break the camel's back? Natural disasters have catastrophic effects on the world's economy and its prosperity. There are huge insurance losses on top of massive infrastructure and housing losses that have to be rebuilt. Think about Maui and Lahaina. What's that going to cost? Massive amounts of money. The Ukraine war has brought about a very difficult situation, particularly in Africa, where there's drought at the moment in places like Kenya, and there's floods in other places. It's brought starvation in Africa and other places on the planet. And drought in China and strict COVID policy slowed production and smashed the Chinese GDP. It's now down in the low 3%. And worldwide inflation due to war and many disasters caused hardship for nations and their populations. Life is no longer easy, is it? It's not easy anymore. The prosperity of the world is sliding away, and Christ will come in a time of prosperity. That's very, very clear. So I want to show you a couple of things that are happening. Now, this goes back to 2022. This gentleman here called Harry Dent is an economist who foretold the several collapses in the 90s and the 2007 and 8 crisis. He actually wrote a book about that before it happened. This is what he said. He foresaw a major crash, which in the first instance, he says, could wipe 54 to 56%, 58% of markets. He said, this bubble has to crash. It will crash. It will be the crash of your lifetime. It has only just been a question of when it will crash. Now, he thought it was going to crash last year, but that wasn't God's time. But many, many people like him are saying it will happen this year. Or she reads, looks at her news feed. I don't bother with it, but she looks at it. And if she sees something that she thinks I might take an interest in, she'll send it to me. And I took photographs of my phone. All right, these are the messages she sent to me. And you can see some of the information there. Sign, the world is heading for catastrophe. This comes from the Australian News Corporation, which means it probably is wonky. Sign, the world is heading for catastrophe. China collapse sparks contagion panic. China's economic troubles and send Hong Kong stocks into bear market. China's horror 468 billion death spiral. Aussie dollar drops because of China, and so on. It's there every day. 2 or 3 articles on China's problems. So China is a catalyst for the collapse that's coming. So what is happening in China? Well, inflation is a major problem for most prosperous nations. For example, United States of America, Europe, Britain, Australia, we've all got an inflation problem. So I don't know what your central bank, your treasury is doing here, but I think they're doing the same as us. Well, in fact, I do know they're raising interest rates. Most are rapidly raising once record low interest rates to slow economies, to stop economies, to sort of bring them to a halt so that they can lower inflation. That's what caused the stock market crash on the 29th of October, 1929. The Treasury raised interest rates rapidly, just like we've done in Australia, just like you've done in the US. China, however, is suffering a different problem. China's problem is deflation. What that means is this: we're suffering inflation. So when you go to the shopping centre or you go to fill up your vehicle with gas, as they call it in America, it's now costing you, in Los Angeles, it was costing them $5.65 for a gallon. Oh, it's a bit cheaper here. But when I was here last time, 3 or 4 years ago, I was in a service station and I was filling up my car at $1.80 a gallon. I got it as low as $1.47 in Albuquerque. But at that particular station with $1.80, there was a woman shaking her fist and yelling, "This is ridiculous!" At $1.80 a gallon? We pay $2 something a litre in Australia. So it's getting tougher. They are not suffering from inflation in China. They're suffering from deflation. Their prices have gone down. So how do you treat that? If the way to handle inflation is to raise interest rates rapidly, then if you want to get your economy stirred up and back into gear, then you've got to lower interest rates. Okay, and that's what they're doing. To stimulate this spluttering economy, you've got to lower interest rates. Consequently, capital and savings are fleeing China to nations who are raising interest rates. Why would the rich Chinese leave their money in Chinese banks at 0.5%? Why would you do that? Why would you put it into Evergrande or other companies that are desperately seeking funds so they don't go bankrupt? Why would you do that? Put it in the banks in Australia or America. Buy land in America or Australia. That's exactly what they're doing. China owns half of Australia. See what's happening? So they can't survive because there's no money there anymore. Let me just show you what that means. Construction companies are collapsing all over the world at an alarming rate. In Australia, ASIC, that's a government agency that monitors what's happening in society, ASIC data has revealed that 2,117 Australian building companies went into liquidation in just 1 year, the financial year from July 1st to June 30, 2023. So from July, I should say, the 1st, 2022, through to 30th of June, 2023, 2,117 Australian building companies, some of them huge, went into liquidation. We've got a shortage in Australia of 780,000 houses. How are we going to get them built? That's why people in the street, living in the street. Now, I don't know what the situation in America, but it probably is all that much better. In China, however, I do know what the situation is. Evergrande, which was in trouble 2 or 3 years ago, serious trouble, the second largest construction company in China, and another one called Country Garden are on the brink of collapse. Evergrande has got 30 days. From 2 or 3 days ago, they've got 30 days to find the money to survive. Otherwise, they're going to be allowed to go over the edge. It's 30 days. Add 30 days to August. What is the day? 19? We're getting into September. You know when crashes come? Everyone since 1929, late September, early October. This is what Reuters said yesterday, 18th of August. This is talking about China. Since the sector's debt crisis unfolded in mid-2021, companies accounting for 40% of Chinese home sales have defaulted. Most of them private property developers. China will be the catalyst, I believe, for the collapse that is coming. When I used to work for the Reserve Bank, which is our central bank in Australia, economists were telling us, this is 25 years ago. Go back and look at the talks. I mentioned this 25 years ago, over and over again. They said that if the Chinese economy ever got down below 6% GDP, the rest of the world would go into deep recession. They never use the word depression, always recession. I'll tell you what depression means in a minute. So, you know what China is now? 3.3, 3.2, thereabouts. And they have been between 10 and 12% for about 15 years prior to that. Why has that happened in China? Well, it's happened because they had a drought in China last year. There wasn't enough water in the rivers to create hydropower. So they had to close factories down. And they closed this section of factories down this week, and then they could open up, and then the next section of factories would be closed because they didn't have enough power. Shiploads of Australian coal sitting out on the ocean for 6 months. And they wouldn't take it because Australia had offended them. We'd said nasty things about their human rights. Closed down the country for 2 months for COVID because they had a zero COVID policy. You see the angels. It's like Brother Thomas once said. He said in Eureka, whom Yahweh seeks to destroy, he first infatuates. In other words, he turns them nuts. You know, he first infatuates, and they can't think straight. And the Chinese leadership has made some ridiculous decisions. So let's move on. Snippets from the news. Stock market crash is coming in 2023, said the Business Insider, November last year. Even if the US economy avoids recession, it doesn't matter if the US economy goes into recession or not. CNN, 23rd of September 2020, said this about the difference between a depression and a recession. Recessions are periods of economic decline that last at least 2 quarters, while depressions are economic declines that last for years. With the global economy on lockdown for most of the first quarter, a recession is almost guaranteed. Consider this is over 3 years ago, they're saying this. They go on to say that, but it will take an unexpected and devastating economic shock to tip the economy into a full-blown depression. A stock market crash may be the trigger. Well, I just told you what I think the catalyst is going to be. I think the angels have been working very hard. Now, why is that important? Why does there have to be a depression, do you think? Well, I'm going to give you the answer to that. Depressions always produce huge change. Things change very quickly when economic necessity, that includes war, starvation, and crime, are present. And the time of trouble, which is coming, will produce similar dramatic changes in the alignment of nations in much worse circumstances than existed in the Depression years of the 1930s. You know, when you go back and consider the alliances between nations in the First World War and the Second World War, they turned upside down. So Japan was on Britain's side in the First World War, and Turkey was on Germany's side. Second World War, Japan is on Germany's side and Turkey's on Britain's side. See? That was brought about by the Depression, in part. So we know that certain things have yet to happen in terms of Bible prophecy. The nations of Europe, for example, must be brought into the Gogian Confederacy. They're a long way from that right now, but a depression will change all that. The papacy must regain effective political influence in Southern Europe. Yep. The depression will bring that about too. We saw that in the 1990s in Russia. The communists had destroyed 10,000 Russian Orthodox churches. They'd forced the church underground. But in the ragged years, the Yeltsin years of the 1990s, you know where people went? When you're poor and you find it hard just to get by, you know what you do? You go back to religion. And that's why the Pope's going to regain a great deal of influence in Europe when this depression hits. And a time of trouble such as never been seen in history descends upon mankind. The nations from Syria to Pakistan, for example, must be brought under Russian control. So there's quite a lot of things. I could list a number of things that have yet to be fulfilled in terms of Bible prophecy. It will come about on the back of that depression. So what do depressions do? Well, here's the timeline of depressions. 1929, stock market crash. By 1930, the world is in a depression. It took 10 years to come out of it, and only because the world went to war. 2020 something, whatever that might turn out to be. They know a huge crash is coming. It'll take another 10 years, and you only get out of it by a war. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that there is no way that we could go through all of that in the absence of Christ. Because to get out the other side, beyond the war, would take another 15 years from now. If we go into the depression this year, take another 15 years to get to a time of prosperity. And he's coming in a time of prosperity. And 2060 is 37 years away, and that's when the papacy and the empire that supports that system will be destroyed. Not all Catholics, but that's when they'll be destroyed. There ain't enough time, seeing there's a 40-year period of divine judgment. Oh, some say, oh, but you can't say that Christ is going to come in 2023. Well, I'm not saying he will. I'm putting the evidence in front of you. You make the choice. You make the decision. So could 2023 be the year of Christ's return? If you've seen or not seen Brother Ken Whitehead's work on the times of Daniel 12, if you've seen it, you'll know the benefit of it. If you haven't seen it, we can make it available to you. I'll put a piece of paper out for you to jot your name down if you like, and I can just give me your email address and I'll send it out to you. I want you to come to Daniel chapter 12. Now, Brother Ken, who's been a very good friend of mine for about 55 years or so, is a very good Bible student, and he's come up with things in recent times on China and on the times of Daniel that, quite frankly, I knew nothing about. Well, no, I didn't know nothing about it, but I didn't know much about it. So it's well worth listening to. He's done a series of talks on this matter, but there's one in particular that's well worth listening to. Daniel chapter 12 has 3 time periods in it. You find the first one in verse 7. He says, I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth for ever and ever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. Now, those of you familiar with Daniel know that that's a period of 1,260 days, and on the day for a year principle, it's 1,260 years. So what would be the end? What's going to be achieved after the 1,260 years? Well, it tells you. When he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So it's about the end of Israel's scattering. Well, of course, it's Elijah who will bring them all back to the land after Armageddon. It doesn't mean that. What does it mean then? Well, you see, Israel never had a place, or the Jews never had a place for security. The state of Israel was declared in 1948. So 1948, Israel became a nation again, effectively ending the scattering in that sense. They had a place where they could go and find security. Stepping back 1,260 years from 1948, you come to AD 688, when construction began on the Dome of the Rock. And the dome of the rock is the abomination of desolation that is spoken of in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11. Now, there are 3 abominations of desolations in Daniel. There was, of course, the prophecy that Christ introduces in Matthew 24 of the Roman desolation. And there's the prophecy in Daniel 11 about the Greek desolation. This is the 3rd one. So it goes back to when they began to build the Dome of the Rock, AD 688. Come to verse 12 of Daniel 12. Here we have verse 11 actually, and verse 12. You've got the 2nd and 3rd periods of time. In Daniel 12, verse 12, it speaks of 1335 years, 1,305 years, or 1335 years. And it's an important time because in the next verse you read that this is the time when Daniel is given his inheritance. So clearly that's the end, when the saints will receive their inheritance. Okay, that's exactly 75 years longer than 1260. If the start date of Daniel 12 verses 7 and 11 and 12 is the same, AD 688, the 1335 days must end in 2023. And if you use the same start date for the 1290 period of verse 11, it begins with the setting up of the abomination in AD 688 and ends in 1978. Now, this is where Brother Ken had to do some hard work. He searched through mountains of documents, and he discovered this fact, that in 1978, after the Camp David Accords were signed at the end of 1977, when President Sadat of Egypt got up and made a speech in 1978, he said this, that all the holy places in Jerusalem should be accessible to everyone for worship, including the Temple Mount. So you've got these 3 time periods. You've got the 1260, which we believe terminates in 1948, takes you back to 688. You've got the 1290, if you come from 688 forward, it brings you to 1978, when there was access given to the Jews. They didn't get it, by the way, but it was at least offered. And then you've got the 1335, if you take the same start date, which ends in 2023. Time will tell. But no one should go away saying, "Oh, that Jim Cowie, he said the price would come in." Because I get accused of that all the time. And so others do. I didn't say that. I'm just asking you to look at the evidence. Paul says we should know the times, and the word is chronos. It's got to do with chronology, and the seasons. It's got to do with the character. Just like a season changes, it's the character of the times. He said, "Brethren, I don't need to write to you about the times and the seasons. You know them perfectly well." Do we? How do we read the times and the season? I'm going to leave that behind now. I'm going to go on to the insanity of this world. You're all familiar with Revelation 16:14. Please turn it up with me. A few years ago, I didn't think it was possible we would get to where we are today. The insanity of this world. But if we'd just read carefully, Revelation 16:14, well, yeah, we should have suspected it. Because this is what Christ says. He's talked about the 3 unclean spirits like frogs in verse 13. We know that that's the French influence, the French Revolution, which brought about the spirit of humanism, liberty, equality, and fraternity. We know that. But this is what he says about it in verse 14. "For they are the spirits of demons." Now, spirit, of course, here is an ideology. It's a way of thinking. It's used that way in many places in the New Testament. They're the spirits of devils or demons. In those days, if you were nuts, if you were insane, they thought you were possessed by demons. I mean, that wasn't the case, but it's no different from what the language that we would use. You ever called anybody a lunatic? Of course there are lunatics all over the place. But lunatic means you've been smitten by the moon. You don't believe that. But that's part of our lingo. That's the language of the day, see? And it was the language of the day in Christ's day. To call someone who was insane, he was possessed by demons. James uses a very similar word. He talks about producing confusion in every evil work. So the spirits of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, otherwise known as humanism, are what the Lord's talking about. Okay, so what does he say about it in verse 14? It says, which go forth, in other words, they're active, they're not sort of sleepy, it's woke, you know, they're active, they're angry, they go forth, they're challenging you, they're in your face. Education, university, schools, they're in your face. Go forth. Under the kings of the earth, there's hardly a government on earth not affected by it. It's introducing legislation that's insane. And he says, the whole world. The word is oikomene, the inhabited world. Hardly a soul on earth is going to be untouched by this stuff, he says. To gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And then he grabs the pen from John's hand and says, I think my servants need a warning. Because it's not John who's writing, verse 15, it's Christ. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And then it's John who goes back and says in verse 16, and he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. So Christ knew, brothers and sisters, that the brotherhood would be affected by these spirits. Anybody going to tell me it's not? End of story. And the insanity of humanism is evident everywhere. Since the 1960s, there has been this relentless assault on previously widely held moral standards that came from the Bible that were based on Judeo-Christian values and teachings. The equality of women, promoted in the International Women's Year of 1975, is now almost universal, except in some Muslim communities across the globe. And homosexuality, once forbidden and frowned upon in society, is now accepted as normal, even more normal than normal. And same-sex marriage is now protected by law in many countries. There's hardly a government in the Western world that hasn't introduced legislation about that. And the latest insanity is the liberty given to children to determine their own sex. Sister sent me recently an article from Florida where there are organisations who are dedicated to allowing parents to have the sex of 2-year-old children changed. What choice does a 2-year-old have? That's the sort of thing that's going on. Margaret went into a toilet in the Seattle airport, and as she's walking in, a man was walking out. She didn't notice the sign that said that this is a gender-neutral facility. How ridiculous is that? I refused to go into one of those. I walked 100 miles to find one that didn't have gender neutral. Get the idea? It's insane, isn't it? And even the world's beginning to realise that. Sex change operations are now accepted as a human right. And this has brought confusion and vexation, particularly in the sporting world. I mean, if I wanted to win a gold medal at the Olympics, I'm going to get a sex change because I can beat those women. Well, they don't have, you know, men and women playing against each other in tennis, do they? Or even soccer, because they get thrashed. It's a stupid world. The cancel culture continues to pressure governments to order history, and they're knocking over statues of people who had any relationship to slavery or whatever. And the moral laws and principles of the Word of God have been completely forgotten and abandoned. That's all I'm going to say about that. Except this, we're now getting pushback. We're getting pushback. And there are 13 states in America that have now got anti-abortion laws in place. We're getting people saying, enough is enough. This is so stupid. I'm not going to go down that path anymore. What that's telling me is it's mature. It's reached its maturity. And the pushback from ordinary, everyday people in the street who once would just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, now saying no. That means we're close to the end. It's mature. What Christ said was going to happen has happened. Let's move on then to the Russian conflict in Ukraine. There are continuing reports of major setbacks and retreats by Russian forces in Ukraine. You know, the press is like the governments of the world. They want to see Russia defeated. They want to see democracy survive in the Ukraine. And it's given rise to optimism that Russian troops will one day be evicted. Well, they don't know their Bible, do they? It would be the end of Putin, for example. He's frightened that he's going to have a Gaddafi end to his political career. He doesn't want that. And he's likely to resort to radical measures like those used in Syria. Relentless bombing of civilian populations, destruction of all infrastructure, and even the use of chemical or limited nuclear weapons. But one thing is certain, Putin will not give up on his objectives until he's dead. And the rat is playing the long game. Vladimir Putin once recounted the great lesson he learned as a teenager with a rat. And the world needs to take notice of that lesson because he's going to hit out of his corner. And I'll show you, he says it in his own words. He doesn't have any other way to go, he'll hit out. And Bible prophecy requires many European nations to be part of a Russian confederacy at the time of Armageddon. Ukraine fatigue is already setting in Europe, starting to argue amongst themselves about how they can continue to support Ukraine against Russia. There's a shortage of ammunition, there's a shortage of weapons. They've restricted certain things the Ukrainians want to do, they can't do it. Time will come, coming depression will end the support for the Ukraine democracy. And the failure of COP27 illustrates the trend. You know, when it comes down to self-interest, brothers and sisters, nations choose in their own interest. Forget about Ukraine. This is the rat. Now, this is the story. It's in the Atlantic, 2nd of August, 2023. Once when he and his friends were chasing rats with sticks in the dilapidated apartment buildings in St. Petersburg, where he grew up, a huge rat he'd cornered suddenly lashed around, and this is the words of Putin himself in an interview, lashed around and threw itself at him, chasing the surprised and frightened Putin to his door before he slammed it shut in the rodent's face. For Putin, it's a parable. This is what he said. I got a quick and lasting lesson in the meaning of the word corner. You corner this rat, and he'll press a button. He'll do something extraordinary. He's almost there. The Bible's very clear. You know this passage better than I do. We've got here two literal translations. Son of man set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog. And the land of Magog happens to embrace what was originally the kingdom of the Rus, Prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. This is Kievan Rus. This was the empire of Putin's hero, Vladimir I, who reigned in 1015. He established the capital of that kingdom, which was called Kiev, in 989 AD. Putin wants it. He wants it. He wants to re-establish the old Russian Empire. He ain't going to give up. Ukraine and Belarus are a very large portion of what historians will tell you was the ancient Magog. Gog of the land of Magog, Prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. This is what he wrote on the 12th of July 2021 in a very lengthy article. During the recent direct line, that's when he speaks to the public, when I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. These words were not driven by some short-term consideration or prompted by the current political context. It is what I have said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe. I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Anybody entertains the notion that Vladimir Putin will say, oh no, it's too much, I'm going to give up, is nuts. He's not going to give up. He never will give up. And I'll tell you something, if someone shoots him in the head tomorrow, sitting behind him, they say, are worse people than Vladimir Putin. Worse than him. Someone else will take over. And they will eventually conquer the Ukraine and the Belarus. This is an article. The world should know where Russia's invasion of Ukraine might ultimately lead. Christians, wake up! If the world doesn't stop Putin, NATO and Israel are next. It goes on to talk about that. This is published on the 22nd of February 2022, 2 days before the invasion. At his core, Putin is a mafia boss, obsessed with power and wealth and willing to rob, kill or destroy to obtain both. Putin sees himself following in the tradition of the Russian Tsars, believing he has a divine right to rule with an iron hand and is permitted to use any means necessary to rebuild the glory of Mother Russia. What a chilling combination. Once you understand all this, you'll understand that Putin doesn't simply want to retake Ukraine, he wants more. Specifically, he wants to force the collapse of NATO as well. Once Putin has seized Ukraine and the Baltics, will any small country be safe from his grasp? Will Israel? Goes on to talk about the fact that the time will come when Israel's neighbours will say, Russia, why aren't you doing something about Israel? Because in fact, Israel does have an agreement with Putin. Netanyahu is quite close to Putin. Russia building an image empire. This is what Brother Thomas wrote in the preface to Help Us Israel. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. A long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact. And salvation will be to those who not only look for it, but have trimmed their lamps by believing the gospel of the kingdom unto obedience of faith, and the perfection thereof in fruits meet for repentance. So finally, it needs to be finally, I want to just talk briefly about the years of ceaseless disasters. You're aware, of course, that I think Category 4, you call them hurricanes, we call them cyclones in Australia, is heading up the coast of California. It's the largest since 1938, and it's likely to dump flood rains on California and even Las Vegas. Good if that got washed away, wouldn't it? So, 2022 saw a continuous string of natural disasters which humanity blames solely on climate change and global warming. Fires, floods, drought, famine, rising sea levels, catastrophic weather events filled the year and caused economic and human distress all over the world. The COVID pandemic and other respiratory illnesses continue to overload medical systems and threaten economies. Can you get enough doctors in your hospitals? We can't. Nurses? No. Terrible shortage. 2023 has seen a continuance of major catastrophes. Why is that so? Is it just climate change? Is it man's responsibility, or is God involved? Look at Luke chapter 21. Now, Luke 21, verses 9 to 11, is about, of course, the preparations for AD 70. And AD 70 is referred to in verses 23 and 24. But look at verse 11 in particular. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. You know what the most important word in that verse is? From. It's the Greek preposition apo. A-P-O. It has to do with origin. So the translation is pretty good. If you're from Texas, for example, that's your origin, isn't it? I'm from Australia. And there the twain shall meet. I had to put that in there, guys. Sorry. That is, we're being told that the disasters that occurred prior to AD 70 were from heaven. It was the angels who were manipulating what was happening. Why would it be any different, brothers and sisters, in the preparations leading up to Armageddon? It isn't. We read this in Revelation 11:18. How true this is. And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name. Doesn't matter where they sit in the scheme of things, small and great. And shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth, a word that means to rot thoroughly. And mankind has done that physically with the planet, and even worse in the moral arena. They have rotted it thoroughly, and they're about to meet their demise. Even so come, Lord Jesus.